It was a bright Monday morning when Charles Bell stepped into the marble-floored lobby of Union First Bank. The sun streamed through the tall glass windows, bouncing off polished brass fixtures. Dressed in a crisp gray suit, Charles looked every bit the professional. Calm, dignified, composed. He held an envelope in his hand. Inside, a cashier's check. Large, legitimate. Nothing unusual, at least not to him. He waited patiently in line, offering a polite nod to the security guard who barely looked up. A few minutes later, he approached the teller's window. "Good morning," Charles said, placing the envelope down gently. "I'd like to deposit this check into my business account, please." The young teller, no older than 23, looked at the amount and blinked. Her eyes darted up to Charles, then back down to the check. "One moment, sir." She stood and disappeared into the office behind her. Minutes passed. When she returned, she wasn't alone. A tall, lean man in his 50s trailed behind her. Stern expression, slicked back gray hair, pinstripe suit too sharp for a quiet branch like this one. "Hello," the man said curtly, looking Charles up and down without offering a handshake. "I'm Mr. Whitaker, the branch manager. I've been informed there's an issue with the check you've presented." Charles raised an eyebrow. "An issue? It's drawn from a corporate account, from one of our vendors. It's valid." "Yes, well," Whitaker replied, folding his arms. "I'm afraid we'll need to verify a check of this size more thoroughly. It's not every day we see something like this." Charles's jaw tightened ever so slightly. "Something like what?" Whitaker gave a thin smile that didn't touch his eyes. "You understand? These things require caution. Fraud is not uncommon." Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Is that your policy for everyone?" he asked quietly. Whitaker didn't answer directly. "You're welcome to wait in the lobby while we make some calls." And just like that, the envelope, and the legitimacy of the man holding it, were pushed aside, lumped in with suspicion, doubt, and polite condescension. Charles stepped back, took a deep breath, and sat down. He had been here before. Not in this exact building, but in moments like this, where the benefit of the doubt was a luxury reserved for someone else. But this time, he decided he wasn't going to walk out quietly. This building had a secret the manager didn't know. And soon, Mr. Whitaker would learn the truth. He wasn't just turning away a customer. He was disrespecting the man who signed the deed on the very foundation beneath their feet. Charles sat quietly in the waiting area, his hands resting calmly on his knees. The bank's air conditioning hummed overhead. A child played with a toy truck across the room. A woman filled out a deposit slip near the window. Everything looked normal. But beneath that still surface, something had shifted. Charles pulled out his phone. Not rushed, not angry, just deliberate. He scrolled through his contacts and tapped one. It rang only once. "Raymond," Charles said into the receiver, his voice even. "I'm at Union First, yes, the downtown branch." A pause. "No, nothing's wrong. Not yet. But I think you should give their regional VP a call. Remind him who holds the lease on this building." Another pause. A small smile tugged at the edge of Charles's mouth as he listened to the answer. "Thank you," he said. "No urgency. Just a gentle nudge." He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. Across the lobby, the bank manager, Mr. Whitaker, stood in his glass office making his own call. To the issuing bank, to the regional fraud team, or maybe just to save face. He glanced out the window occasionally, watching Charles like a problem he didn't know how to solve. Then something changed. One of the assistant managers walked briskly across the floor, phone in hand. She knocked once on Whitaker's door and entered without waiting. A brief whispered conversation followed, short, tense. Whitaker's face paled. He turned slowly and looked at Charles again. This time, not with arrogance, with confusion, and a flicker of worry. Moments later, the teller returned with the envelope in her hand, now accompanied by the assistant manager. "Sir," she said, her tone noticeably more careful, "we've completed the verification. Everything is in order. Your check will be deposited today, and the funds will clear within 24 hours." Charles rose slowly and accepted the envelope back. I assume there will be no further issue with my account? He asked, not unkindly. Of course not, Mr. Uh, the assistant manager hesitated, unsure of the name. Charles leaned in, calm but direct. Bell. Charles Bell. You'll find it listed on the lease agreement for this entire building, including your office silence. The teller blinked. The assistant manager stiffened. A slow, dawning realization spread across their faces, and then behind them, Whitaker stepped into the open, adjusting his tie but saying nothing. The lobby was suddenly quiet. Charles straightened his suit jacket and gave them a polite nod. Thank you for your time, he said. And with that he turned and walked out, not triumphant, not smug, just as he had walked in, composed, confident, but now undeniably recognized. Later that afternoon, the mood in Union First Bank had shifted from controlled routine to thinly veiled panic. Mr. Whitaker stood in his office, the blinds half drawn, staring out at the street below where Charles Bell had calmly exited just hours earlier. The manager's phone lay flat on his desk, screen lit with an email still open. Subject: Urgent. Leaseholder contact incident. From Regional Director, Facilities and Property Management. Please provide a written summary of your interaction with Mr. Charles Bell this morning. Be advised, Mr. Bell is listed as the primary leaseholder and silent partner of the building that houses your branch. The property is owned through Bell Weston Holdings. This is not the first complaint we've received involving bias at your location. Whitaker's throat went dry. It wasn't just that he had made a mistake. It was that he had made a mistake with power. And not the kind of power that flaunts itself, but the quiet kind that owns the floor under your feet and doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. His assistant entered cautiously. Sir, there's a call for you. Corporate Whitaker straightened his tie, but it felt tighter than usual. Put it through. The voice on the line wasn't angry, just cold. We'll be conducting an internal review, said the regional VP. We expect full cooperation. And Mr. Bell has been invited to a meeting with executive leadership next week. I suggest you come prepared to listen, not talk. That was it. The call ended. Whitaker sat down hard in his chair. The desk felt larger now, his office smaller. Across town, Charles Bell was sitting in a quiet cafe, laptop open, reviewing a zoning permit for a commercial lot, 2 counties over. He had already moved on. In his world, problems were solved with precision, not noise. His phone vibrated. A message from his assistant. Corporate invited you for lunch Monday. They want to discuss bank operations in the region. Said they're interested in your insights. Charles smiled faintly and typed back, confirm it. He sipped his coffee, glancing out the window at the modest skyline of Whitestone. Funny how quickly the air changes when people realize who they're really talking to. But for Charles, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about proving a point. It was about something quieter, dismantling expectations. Not for applause, not for validation, but to quietly hold open a door for whoever came after him. And that door? It was already off its hinges. Monday arrived with a crisp autumn breeze cutting through the city. At precisely 12 p.m., Charles Bell stepped out of a Blacktown car in front of a gleaming glass tower, Union First's regional headquarters. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, subtle cufflinks, and a look of quiet resolve. No entourage, no noise, just presence. Inside, he was greeted by a young executive assistant who offered him coffee, water, anything. Everyone seemed to know who he was now, or at least who they had missed recognizing before. Right this way, Mr. Bell. He was led into a private conference room on the top floor, where 3 senior executives were already seated around a polished walnut table. The city skyline glowed behind them. Mr. Bell, said a silver-haired woman, rising from her chair, thank you for coming. We really appreciate your time. Charles nodded. Thank you for the invitation. Pleasantries were exchanged. Food was brought in. But it didn't take long for the conversation to shift. We want to first extend an apology, said one of the men, loosening his tie slightly. What happened at the Whitestone branch was unacceptable, and frankly, a liability, not just ethically, but operationally. Charles listened. We'd like your input, the woman continued, not just as the property owner, but as someone who clearly has experience navigating business with grace. We're starting a regional advisory panel. External partners, strategic thinkers. Representation matters. Charles let the room settle for a moment. Then, calmly, he spoke. You don't need me to join a panel, he said. You need to fix your culture. The room went silent. I've walked into rooms like that bank all my life, he continued. Sometimes I push through, sometimes I walk away. But the burden has always been on people like me to carry that weight quietly. He leaned forward. I own the building. But that manager looked at me like I didn't even belong in the lobby. That's not just about policy. That's about blindness. One of the executives opened his mouth to respond. But Charles raised a hand slightly. I'm not interested in being your token success story. I'm interested in helping you build a system where the next man or woman who looks like me doesn't need to prove anything just to be served. The woman across the table nodded slowly. There was no PR smile, no fake empathy. Just listening. Then what do you propose? She asked sincerely. Charles thought for a moment. I'll consult, he said, for free. But under one condition, I choose the people for the first training. And I want that manager, Whitaker, in the front row. The room exchanged glances. Agreed, she said. He stood, shook their hands, and walked out, leaving a room full of people who finally understood that authority doesn't always arrive with a loud voice or a big title. Sometimes it walks in quietly and owns the building. The following week, Charles returned to the Whitestone branch, not through the front doors, but through the private elevator tucked away in the building's rear lobby. This time, he wasn't alone. He was greeted by a young woman in her early 20s, wearing a navy blue Union First intern badge and a hopeful smile that barely masked her nervousness. Mr. Bell, she said, extending her hand, I'm Amara. I've been assigned to assist you during your visit. Charles shook her hand gently. Nice to meet you, Amara. First day, she laughed. First week, and first time meeting someone who actually owns the building I work in. He gave a half smile. Firsts are good. Keeps us learning. As they stepped off the elevator and into the main floor of the bank, Charles noticed subtle changes. The atmosphere was different. The tellers stood a little straighter. The manager's office door, once closed tight, now stood open. But what caught Charles's eye was the quiet tension in the air as Mr. Whitaker emerged from that same office. The man's pride had clearly taken a hit. He looked older somehow, smaller, but he was still there, still in position. For now. Mr. Bell, Whitaker said with forced politeness, welcome back. Charles nodded, offering no warmth but no hostility either. Mr. Whitaker. They stood face to face for a moment, long enough for the staff nearby to pause what they were doing. Then Charles turned to Amara. Would you mind showing me the break room? I'd like to speak with a few of the new hires there. Of course, she said, leading him toward the back. Inside the small kitchen, 2 other interns were seated, both young, both quietly working through onboarding materials. When they saw Charles enter with Amara, they stood up quickly. No need, Charles said. Relax. He took a seat at the small round table, gesturing for them to do the same. I wanted to talk to you all because I know how it feels to be underestimated, he began. How it feels to walk into rooms and wonder if someone sees you or just your skin. The room went still. Amara sat straighter. One of the interns, a young man named Malik, nodded slowly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I've built companies. I've made mistakes. I've won deals and lost them. But I never forgot what it felt like to be dismissed before I even opened my mouth. He looked at each of them in turn. You're not here to just make coffee or file reports. You're here to learn, to grow, and to take up space. Amara's eyes shimmered. I'll be keeping an eye on this branch, he added. Not because I expect problems, but because I expect better. They all nodded. The moment settled in. Not loud, but real. Charles stood up. You don't owe anyone your silence. Just your excellence. He left them with that, and as he stepped back into the hallway, he saw Whitaker watching from a distance. Charles didn't look away. He walked past the manager without a word, but with every step the message rang louder than any speech. The future is already walking through the doors you tried to close. The following Friday, a folding sign stood at the front of Union First Bank's Whitestone branch. DEI training in progress. Please use rear entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was far from ordinary. The front lobby had been cleared, chairs arranged in rows, and a small projector screen stood near the teller counter. Most of the staff looked uncertain, a few downright uncomfortable. At the front sat Charles Bell. He didn't lead the training, he had hired someone for that. A woman named Denise Powers, a renowned diversity and equity consultant, with a voice that cut through performative politeness like a blade through silk. She wasn't here to sugarcoat anything, and Charles wanted it that way. Whitaker sat in the front row, just as Charles had requested. His posture was stiff, defensive, but Charles had no interest in humiliating the man, only in making sure he finally listened. Denise began with the basics, the data, the institutional bias that crept into systems through culture, not policy. Real stories from real customers, anonymous reviews from within their own branch, including one teller who had written, "Sometimes we're taught to protect the company more than we're taught to respect the customer." Whitaker shifted in his seat. Then Denise played the clip of a man in a suit being detained in another city for cashing his own check, and the room went still. "How many of you," she asked, "would have reacted the same way? Not because you're evil, but because you never questioned your instinct?" No one spoke. Charles sat quietly in the back, watching, measuring. Then, Denise turned toward the front row. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice neutral, "would you like to share how it felt to realize the man you challenged owned your entire building?" The air in the room thickened. Whitaker cleared his throat. "Embarrassed," he said. "Ashamed, honestly." A long pause. "But mostly," he added, "aware of how automatic my assumptions were. I've been in banking for 25 years, and I thought I was fair. I really did." Denise nodded. "Fair isn't neutral. Fair requires awareness." That sentence landed hard. When the session ended, a quiet hum of conversation broke out. Staff members lingered, asking questions, shaking hands, even thanking Denise. But it was what happened next that mattered most. Whitaker approached Charles as he stood near the exit. "Mr. Bell," he said, voice low, "you didn't have to do all this. You could have had me fired." Charles looked at him for a long moment. "I don't want you fired," he said. "I want you changed." Whitaker nodded. For once, no ego, just humility. Charles didn't smile, but there was a softness in his eyes. "People like me don't need your protection," he said. "We need your understanding." And with that, he stepped out into the cool afternoon air, letting the doors close behind him. Inside, something had shifted. Not in policy, but in people. A week later, Charles Bell sat in his home office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and sunlight streaming in through tall windows. On his desk sat a neat stack of files, zoning permits, lease proposals, and a draft for a new financial literacy initiative he'd been working on for local schools. But what caught his eye wasn't any of those. It was a small white envelope, hand-addressed in careful, slanted handwriting. No return address. Just his name. Mr. Bell Whitestone, New York Curious. He opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper, the lines faint under neat, penciled words. "Dear Mr. Bell, my name is Malik. I'm one of the interns at the Whitestone branch. You probably don't remember me. I was sitting in the break room when you talked to us last week. I just wanted to say thank you. I've seen things happen to my mom at grocery stores and to my uncle at his job, and I always thought we just had to live with it. That being quiet and polite was the best we could do. But when I saw you, how calm you were, how much power you had just by telling the truth, I realized we don't have to stay small to survive. You changed how I think about myself, about what I can be. I didn't know black men could own buildings like that, or walk into rooms without explaining themselves, or get mistaken for less. and still stand tall like you did. Someday I want to own something too. Maybe a business, maybe a bank. Anyway, thank you for showing me what's possible. Malik Charles read the letter twice, then a third time. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and exhaled. This, this was why he had stayed quiet in that bank. Not out of weakness, but because sometimes holding your peace becomes a lesson louder than anger. Sometimes, the most radical thing a black man can do is simply belong without apology, and let the world watch how deeply that unnerves it. He folded the letter and placed it inside his leather-bound journal. Then he picked up his pen and began drafting something new. Not a zoning permit this time, but a scholarship fund. He had already chosen the first name to put on the list: Malik.